This is an aerial photo of downtown Macon in the early 1960s. Unless you look closely, you can't tell much difference from downtown Macon in the 1980s. On a closer examination, however, the first thing you might notice is there's not an interstate highway in sight, not even a 2nd Street bridge. There's no Liberty Federal Building, no Charter Medical Building, no Hilton Hotel, not even a Coliseum. Up there near the top of the picture is a big brooding old building called the Old Wesleyan Conservatory. It's not there anymore, and why it's not there is one of the main news stories of the early 60s. Channel 13 had been on the air a whole 7 years when the 60s opened. Our news coverage was primitive by today's standards. It was all black and white and all done on scratchy 16mm film. For the next half hour, we're going to revive some of that old film and take a 25-year journey back in time to Macon and Middle Georgia in the early 60s. As the decade of the 60s opened, Middle Georgia was thrust into the national spotlight when a U-2 pilot named Francis Gary Powers was shot down while on a spy mission over the Soviet Union. Powers, whose wife Barbara lived in Milledgeville, was held prisoner for almost 2 years by the Russians. His downing couldn't have come at a worse time. It scuttled U.S.-Soviet talks on overflights to verify arms reductions.
Mr. Wyszynski very easily passed over the well-recognized value of air reconnaissance for various purposes, particularly of discovering hidden plants, hidden installations, or hidden stockpiles. But then he went on to say that as he understood it, we were suggesting that United States planes fly over Soviet territory for this reconnaissance.
On February the 10th, 1962, word reached Milledgeville that Powers had been traded for master Soviet spy Rudolph Abel. Mrs. Powers hastily left her mother's home on North Jefferson Street to join her husband in Washington, but not before stopping to talk to reporters who had kept an all-night vigil on the front walk. "I'm so happy my heart is just bursting," she said. "I'm going to keep him home this time." Her remarks were interrupted occasionally by Eck, the couple's German police dog, who didn't take kindly to the cameras and lights. Another prominent Middle Georgian from Milledgeville also figured in the news in the early 60s. In 1961, Congressman Carl Vinson was in his 47th year in Congress, and news director Howard Absalom tried, without success, to get him to say he was going to run again.
Congressman, from the way your remarks have been made so far this evening, I don't think you have any intention of dropping out of the congressional race anyhow, do you, sir?
Well, of course, I'm serving now in my 47th year, and I have 1 more year in this term. The last thing I think about is politics. It's too far in advance for me to make any statement at all what I will do in 1962. I'm deeply concerned about doing a good job now, and I can't tell what course I will pursue politically next year.
Mr. Vinson did get the nomination again, and at the September 1962 district convention, warned of the threat of a Russian military buildup in Cuba.
That is the reason that we must deal with the Cuban situation firmly and with determination. We cannot permit Cuba to become a Soviet base for military aggressions in the Western Hemisphere. At this
1961 was not all crisis, however. In that year, Twiggs County's Chess McCartney, otherwise known as the Goat Man, hooked his herd of goats up to his ramshackle wagon and prepared for another cross-country trip. The Goat Man lived in an equally ramshackle trailer on US 80 near Jeffersonville. He He caught the eye of numerous tourists in the days before Interstate 16 emptied the highway of through traffic, but when he took to the road, he was even more of an attention getter. In fact, the local law dreaded his pilgrimages, his slow-moving goats and wagon, and people stopping to look tied up traffic for miles. Chess kept up those cross-country rambles until just a few years ago, when his age finally caught up with him. In the summer of 1961, archaeologists at the Okmulgee National Monument reacted in horror when plans to build Interstate 16 were announced. The reason? The highway would run along the Okmulgee River, through the National Monument, and right through the site of a prehistoric Creek Indian village. Crash excavation was begun to map the site and recover artifacts before it was sealed under concrete. The findings were significant.
By this digging, we have filled in a gap ranging from 2000 BC to 7000 BC, about which we knew nothing here at Okmulgee. We had had a hint earlier of some very early material at about 10,000 years ago, but this 5,000-year gap was filled in by the work done in the floodplain.
When the excavations were complete, bulldozers pushed the dirt back over the ancient village, which still sleeps today beneath the wheels of passing traffic. This is a picture of Channel 13's 1960 election coverage. As you can tell by the names on the boards, it was both a presidential election and a Warner Robins city election. 2 years later, voters went to the polls in a state primary, highlighted by a hotly contested race for governor. As usual, we planned full-blown election coverage, something some viewers didn't take kindly to. They didn't want to lose their regular programs. General Manager Frank Red Cross Crowther, who was never known to mince words, said that the election would be covered, and that included paid political programming time for the candidates.
We feel that this has been the right thing to do. Many of our listeners have disagreed because they expect to be entertained apparently 18 hours a day. We regret that we can't carry both entertainment and matters of public issue at the same time. There is only one television station in Macon. We must serve all the politicians. We can't be like the Atlanta situation where the political advertising is divided between 3 stations. Therefore, no one station is affected too heavily. I hope that with the advent of Election Day tomorrow, the killing of programming tomorrow night to bring you all of the election returns, that this will be the end of political advertising between the hours of 6 and 11:30 p.m. for the current year. That is our hope, and that is our point of service.
During the summer of 1962, a young Augusta attorney, Carl Sanders, and former Governor Marvin Griffin campaigned heatedly for the office being vacated by Ernest Vandiver. During a campaign stop in Macon, Mr. Sanders attacked the record of the Griffin administration.
When he was the executive secretary to former Governor Ed Rivers while he was out of the state, Marvin Griffin signed several hundred pardons in one day, and they were sold like hot dogs at a baseball game for $50 a piece and on up, depending upon the degree of the crime. Of course, this was magnified during his own administration when we had the illegal liquor activities, when we had the activities involving rigged bids and corporations that didn't exist and all types of 10% kickbacks and just all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect to be carried on in government. People that were carrying these things on were appointees of Marvin Griffin. He was responsible for them, and he refused to do anything about them when they were caught in these activities. I don't think people of Georgia want this type of governor or this type of governor.
Gambling in Georgia was illegal in 1962, as it is now. On December the 6th, the law swooped down on what they called a notorious blind tiger in Jones County and padlocked the place. The law was in the person of Okmulgee Circuit Solicitor General George Lawrence and Jones County Sheriff Holmes Hawkins. The place was called the Sportsman's Club near Bradley. Lawrence said the place was a blind tiger where idleness and loitering were encouraged. Hawkins said he had never had any complaints about the place, but he slapped the padlock on anyway. As was the case with the I-16 excavations, in a historic town like Macon, history and progress occasionally collide. They collided again in 1963 when the city needed to widen 7th Street into an industrial boulevard and found the historic Old City Cemetery right in the way. The cemetery, in use from 1825 to 1840, was the city's oldest. It was the final resting place of some of Macon's first settlers, including a group of Irish laborers brought in to help construct the railroad. They were struck down by an epidemic in the early 1800s. History, or at least about 120 feet of it, gave way to progress. The graves along the right-of-way were relocated and the street was widened. 1963 was an election year in Macon, and in the spring of that year, the Macon Area Development Commission's executive director, B.F. Merritt, Jr., announced he was going to give up that job to seek the city's top post.
I have decided to become a candidate for mayor in the forthcoming city primary this summer. And as I have indicated to Mr. Trice, president of MADC, I felt that I should submit my resignation as director of MADC to be effective May the 1st. I have been most interested in Macon's industrial progress since I served as the president of the Chamber of Commerce in 1938. And in this time, I have seen industrial development programs grow throughout the country to where they now constitute the greatest single phase of any community activity. I hope to continue to serve whenever possible to further Macon's industrial progress.
By 1963, interstate highway construction was approaching Macon from the north and the south, but nothing was underway in the city itself, although contracts had been let on that section of I-16. Chamber of Commerce President Emmett Barnes III, whose motto was, Macon on the move, said the city couldn't move with the delays on the crosstown leg of I-75.
I'm not willing to take these delays in 6 months here and there. I think the thing that'll help this community is the crosstown leg. The transportation from one end of the city would be more readily accessible. It would help the economy, and I pledge to do all that's necessary to do it.
Mr. Barnes got his wish. The state let bids on almost 4 miles of the leg in November of that year. After an effort to consolidate Macon and Bibb County's governments flopped in 1960, a group of local business and professional leaders took a new tack. In 1963, the group, called the Citizens Committee for Health and Progress, began a push to merge city and county tax and voter registration offices. The chairman, Dr. B.W. Forrester, made a pitch for the idea at a Chamber of Commerce meeting.
No other community in the state, or perhaps in the Southeast, is in a better position to inaugurate such a program. In such a division of responsibility between our two local governments, there can be no double taxation, nor can there be any duplication of effort, since each of the two governmental units would have a specific responsibility with no overlapping whatever. January 1, 1964 would be a good target date for starting this program. A study group would have to be formed and begin making plans for this program immediately. There is no reason why the governments of Macon and Bibb County, thus organized, should not be a model for all local governments. I believe such a program, if adopted, would operate at the highest level of efficiency for the betterment of our community and to the benefit of all our people.
In 1836, Wesleyan College was chartered as the world's first college for women, and 3 years later opened the original building here on College Street, overlooking the young city of Macon. That first Georgian building looked much like the federal building now occupying the site, except, of course, it was much smaller. In 1881, Wesleyan needed to expand, and the original Georgian building was encased in the rambling old Victorian structure most of us knew as the old Wesleyan Conservatory. It was dormitory and classroom for Wesleyan students for 50 years, until the current campus was opened on Forsyth Road in 1928. Wesleyan continued to use portions of the old building until 1953, when, except for a museum section, it was shut down. The conservatory began a slow decay. By 1960, it was in such bad shape that officials estimated it would take $350,000 to restore it and $50,000 a year to keep it up. The building went on the market. Congressman Carl Vinson figured it was about time Macon had a new post office and federal building, so negotiations began with Wesleyan trustees. College alumni and historic organizations were horrified when they heard the conservatory would make way for a modern building. Under the leadership of Mrs. W.P. Stevens, the Citizens Committee for the Preservation of Old Wesleyan was formed. They held an open house at the building so that residents could see the inside firsthand. They began a fundraising drive to purchase the building and preserve it. Leading community figures, including County Commission Chairman Kenneth Dunwoody and Henry Burns, Jr., contributed to the fund. Dell Ward, assisted by News Director Howard Absalom, filmed a portion of her daily television show at the old conservatory building.
Macon, Georgia. We have with us today Mrs. W.P. Stevens, who is the temporary chairman of a group known as the Committee for the Preservation of Old Wesleyan. And to interview Mrs. Stevens and talk with her about Old Wesleyan, here's Howard Absalom, News Director for WMAZ. Howard?
Thank you, Dell. While the camera is panning around the room here showing some of this lovely old parlor, Mrs. Stevens, I'd like to ask you a few of the questions that have been coming into our newsroom. For instance, you've got a committee, you've got a project, and you've got a big problem. The most pertinent questions asked, of course, are about financing. How do you intend to purchase this building, or what do you intend to do with it after you purchase it?
There are many plans, both for financing and for using the building afterwards. We have a small committee, but we are very enthusiastic and we're working very hard, and we have foundations which we will interview and various ways of raising the money.
At this moment, your financing plans are not quite exactly effective yet. Well, let's go now to Dell Ward and Mrs. Mitchell in another section of the building.
This is the front doorway that enters into the grand entrance hallway to one of the old buildings of Wesleyan.
Well, Dale, first of all, I would like to say that I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the younger Wesleyan alumni. Although we did not live in this building during our college days, most of our grandmothers did, and we feel that this is one of the outstanding and visible traditions of the Wesleyan family, and nothing, it can never be replaced in any way. This is something, Dale, that not only Wesleyan, but the entire city of Macon as well should be proud of, as we are all proud of the other outstanding historical landmarks in the city and in Bibb County. And we feel that the original Wesleyan building should be preserved and maintained as such.
Thank you very much, Mrs. John Mitchell. We are seated under the portrait of Bishop Pierce, who was the first president of Wesleyan. Let's go now to Pierce Chapel, named in his honor. And here we are in Pierce Chapel. You're seeing now many empty seats. These seats were once filled with enthusiastic audiences that applauded the students at Wesleyan College and their plays, and that applauded some of our outstanding operatic and concert artists of bygone days. Mr. Jones, why do you think all of Macon and Middle Georgia, in fact the state of Georgia, should be interested in the preservation of Old Wesleyan?
Well, Wesleyan is a site of something that lived over 100 years ago. But now the new Wesleyan has gone to more elegant, you might say, or lovelier quarters where the children may have a better chance at an education. But this should not be abandoned because it has so many memories, and this spot within a few years will be actually the center of Macon. There will be as much north, east, south, or west. It'll be in the heart of our community and not on the edge somewhere. It's something that Macon should hold on to and cherish.
Thank you for joining us on the stage of Pierce Chapel of Old Wesleyan Conservatory.
But the efforts were to no avail. The Wesleyan trustees, caught between the Save Old Wesleyan movement, a crumbling building, and an offer of more than $500,000 from the feds, opted for the money. But they delayed closing the deal to give the preservationists one more chance. The fund drive had come up with $300,000, too far short of the $500,000. So the deal was signed with the government, and wrecking crews began bringing the old building down. The Save Old Wesleyan group refused to give up. Even while the interior of the building was being stripped and cranes tore away at its roof, they continued the battle to preserve the historic structure. On the morning of February the 12th, 1963, workmen began preparations to remove the old conservatory's bell from its soaring bell tower. At 11:30 a.m., the bell was tolled for the last time. 12 days later, on Sunday morning, February the 24th, 1963, the battle to save Old Wesleyan ended forever. At 5:41, a fire was reported in the main building. When the first units arrived, the flames were already out of control, fueled by the heart pine construction of the old building's interior. Windows had already been removed and the sprinkler system disconnected. Fed by plenty of oxygen and the heart pine, Old Wesleyan's funeral pyre was the most spectacular fire seen in Macon up to that time, and also since, for that matter. The flames roared through the block-long main building and leaped into the adjacent chapel. They also leaped College and Magnolia Streets, destroying 3 apartment houses and leaving 33 families homeless. Firemen evacuated hundreds of others from houses around the fire. Almost miraculously, no one was killed nor seriously injured. Onlookers commented that it was almost as if the old building chose to go out in flames rather than be humiliated by wrecking balls and bulldozers. Macon's fire department found the flames all they could handle. For the first time since World War II, they had to call for outside help. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out, leaving only the gaunt walls of the old conservatory building standing. As some of the Victorian walls fell away, spectators could clearly see the walls of the original 1836 building standing inside the ruins. Red Cross and Salvation Army workers served up coffee and donuts to exhausted firefighters, most of whom had been fighting the fire without a break for 6 hours. They also began seeking emergency housing for the 54 persons burned out by the fire. Firemen stood guard over the ruins all of that Sunday, extinguishing flare-ups and waiting for the ashes to cool. The dangerous task of pulling down the walls of the old building attracted almost as many spectators as the fire itself. As soon as the ruins cooled, the demolition crews were back at the scene, using cranes and wrecking balls to bring down the towering walls. Bricks and mortar, weakened by the intense heat of the fire, came down in a cloud of dust as the wrecking balls hit them. Despite the potential danger as the walls tumbled down, only a few construction workers sustained any sort of injury, and most of those were minor when they were hit by flying debris. The old bell tower, with its bell a molten mass of metal in the ashes, stood almost to the very end. Finally, it too came down in a cloud of dust, and the Old Wesleyan Conservatory became only a part of Macon's history. Little time was wasted. In a few months, workmen were busy erecting the federal government's Old Wesleyan look-alike atop College Hill. The building's design, much enlarged, mimics the classic Georgian architecture of the original 1836 structure. The cycle was complete when on November the 18th, 1964, Congressman Carl Vinson dedicated the new post office building. Well, that's our look back at the early 60s, a time of significant change and development for Macon, and a time when, as now, Channel 13 was reporting and recording those significant milestones.